Prepare to experience the strongest radio allowable by law. Secrets will be revealed. Myths dispelled. From the studio gym where excuses never apply, it's Superhuman Radio with your host, Carl Lenore. Hey, welcome back to another episode of Superhuman Radio. We have some fascinating stuff to talk about today. During the first hour, we're going to be talking about a recent study that was published by Duke University that shows those of us, boomers like myself, who grew up in an era of leaded fuels, leaded gasoline, may have actually lost some IQ points because of our exposure. And the group there took a painstaking approach to looking at available data and using that to overlay onto what we know about lead exposure. And it's pretty shocking. It really is. You know, there's so much going on in the world today that we're going to pay for 100 years from now. Like maybe glyphosate, right? All the stuff that's coming up about Roundup and what it does to people. Like, you know, unfortunately, humans they've deluded themselves into thinking that they are smarter than nature. You know, that we're so smart, we can figure everything out. And it gets us into trouble often. It's probably going to do that forever, as long as we inhabit the earth. And maybe that's why we won't inhabit the earth someday, because we're so pompous and sure that we're so smart. Then later in the show, we're going to talk about herbs, one specific one called pine pollen. It's very fascinating. It's been used for thousands of years, and it actually is a phytoandrogen with properties of testosterone, DHEA, and other hormones found in humans, both men and women. And we're going to talk about its usefulness in supplementing. Before we get started with anything else, we have to thank our title sponsor, and that's, of course, Legendary Foods. Legendary Foods, the makers of the tasty pastry. Ron Penna liked Pop-Tarts, but he didn't like what they were made of. Lots of sugar, gluten, and lots of other crap. And he decided to take the Pop-Tart and make it good for you. And enter the legendary tasty pastry. Tasty pastry looks like a Pop-Tart. Tastes better than a Pop-Tart, has less than 1 gram of sugar, 20 grams of high-quality protein, and 4 to 5 net carbs if you are a low-carb or keto person. That's important to you. And I'll tell you something fascinating about tasty pastries. And those of you with children know that this is true. You can't get your kids to eat a healthy protein bar. They know it doesn't taste good. It doesn't taste like candy. But you will have to fight them to stop eating tasty pastries because they taste that good. You will swear you're eating real cake, and so will your children. And you know what? Take advantage of that. Send them to school with tasty pastries in their lunchbox, and they'll feel like they're eating crap like all the other kids, but they won't be. So check that out. Go to shrnetwork.biz/legendary. I'm sorry, yes, shrnetwork.biz/legendary. Use the code SHR10 to save 10% off. And now, without further delay, I'll bring my guest on. And he is Aaron Reuben from Duke University. How you doing, Aaron?
I'm doing great. It's really nice to be here.
Yeah, thanks for being here. So this is fascinating. I'm a product of this problem here, Aaron, because I'm 63 years old. I used to siphon gas out of my father's car to put in my mini bike, and I've swallowed leaded gas in the past. I guess I'm in trouble, aren't I?
That's not great news. You know, you're not the first person I've heard from who said, I used to siphon gas when I was a kid. I hope that phenomenon's going away a little bit, because leaded gas or not, it's probably not good for you. But even if you didn't siphon gas, yes, based on when you were born, our new study suggests that you likely had lead exposures that today would have caused alarm and clinical concern. So case management, referral to figure out what's going on and how we can get the lead out of your exposome.
So once the lead is in you, you can't get rid of it, right? I've read things about selenium binds to, no, that's mercury. I'm sorry. Selenium binds to mercury, and through the methylation process, you can excrete it. But lead's not one of those things you can get rid of, huh?
At the very high exposure levels, so approaching what we would call lead poisoning, and that approaches levels where your exposure could be fatal, where we're actually going to impair organ ability to function. At those levels, we do have interventions that can bring the levels down. So it's called chelation. We give you elements that compete with your tissue for the lead and sequester it and remove it. But that doesn't bring you down to anything close to acceptable. And for people who grew up during the era of leaded gasoline and who today live in older homes or communities like Flint, where we know their exposures were higher than they should have been, there isn't a whole lot we can do to remove the lead that's there. I mean, not all the lead that you're exposed to will stay locked up in your body forever. Bone tends to sequester lead, depending on the type of bone, for a few years or a few decades. But other tissue systems, the half-life is much shorter, on the order of weeks and months. So you might not need to worry about getting the lead out now. What I'm really concerned is that there are changes that result from that lead exposure, kind of a cascade of events that we don't fully understand, and that seem to play out.
So right now we have epidemic of neuropathies going on in the world, and originally they were assigned to those with diabetes, and it was said it was a glycation problem, that the unbound sugar rising glucose in the blood is kind of like crystallizing and sandblasting the myelin sheets right off of your nerves, and then you get hyperalgesia and you're tingling and pain. But what if it's the lead? Because lead is a neurotoxin. What if it's all the accumulated lead that that humans were exposed to in the 60s and 70s coming back to haunt us?
Yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating question, and I don't think I've seen anyone evaluate that. Like, we know lead's a neurotoxin. We were particularly looking at the kinds of exposures folks alive today had as kids, like yourself, siphoning leaded gas, because the developing brain is so susceptible to harm, and because that neurotoxic exposure can actually perturb your developmental trajectory. So the way your brain develops, we see people not reach their full potential. You're talking about, well, all right, what about decades later? We're starting to ask questions about more age-related aging diseases. That is not something we are easily allowed to study. And when I say allowed, I just mean from a research perspective, we don't have a lot of purchase on things that happen decades apart, because you have to be very clever and plan in advance or get lucky. I'm attached to some studies where we kind of got lucky, where we have archived data from decades ago that we're now trying to leverage to see how folks exposed to lead during the era of leaded gasoline, how they're doing as they age. And we can talk about some of the things we found. We haven't looked at neuropathies, although it's a great question, and we could do that. The question of peripheral nervous system versus central nervous system, it brings into question how things that you're talking about, like diabetes, hypertension, how that interacts with your lead exposure. We know that lead exposure is a plausible risk factor for hypertension and cardiovascular disease. So these things all interact. It's speculative at this point, but totally plausible that lead could be contributing to some of the things that you're concerned about.
So interestingly, iron is another culprit, but we're not talking about that today. But my theory with peripheral neuropathy is twofold, and the flow is a Freudian slip. Blood flow. So people get neuropathy in their hands and their feet first, and this is where blood flow narrows. And if you were if you were a kid, playing in the street after rain, you would throw a popsicle stick and follow it down the street. And where the waterway narrows is where everything kind of gets bogged down, and you have a dam. And so your feet and your lower legs are narrow, your hands are narrow. Then the other thing that I keep thinking about is just the effects of gravity, right? Your hands are usually by your side, your feet are at the bottom. Gravity is pulling things into these areas, compounded with poor blood flow. Everything just gets trapped there. So that's my logic behind iron overload affecting peripheral neuropathy. It could be lead too. Lead's heavy.
Yeah, and we talked about how lead can get locked up in the bone and stay there for decades. There are events that lead to lead being re-released years later. So events that lead to bone turnover, like pregnancy, menopause, osteoporosis, breaking a bone, that could lead to recirculating lead. So even if you haven't been exposed to new lead in 20 years, it's possible that you are being exposed to lead. It's just old lead recirculating. And that's
I was going to ask you this question. So when we talk about the word sequester, right? It's like a virus vault, right? As long as the virus is vault, we don't have to worry about it. So the lead that's sequestered in bone or even in tissue, assuming that it's not brain tissue, is pretty much out of circulation. Is it the lead that's in blood circulation that is the most damaging or dangerous?
Yeah, the question, it really hinges on what you are worried about the most. So if you are worried about bone health and osteoporosis, or let's say dental health, then the lead sequestered, locked up in your bone and your teeth is harmful and has been linked to problems in those domains. If, like me, you study and are concerned with things above the teeth, for the brain, I look at neurodevelopmental disorders, brain aging disorders, psychiatric disease. When I think about those outcomes, every bit of lead that got locked into your bones to me is kind of a win because it didn't reach your brain to impair your nervous system. It's kind of chicken and egg though, because it's not necessarily going to stay in your bone forever. Maybe it'll be re-released later and become a new source of exposure during times in your life when you are going to be less resilient. So what do I mean by that? An adult exposed to lead, we don't anticipate having a lot of central nervous system problems right away, even though, there's no safe level of lead. It's still a neurotoxin. But as you age, all of your organs are less robust. They heal slower. They're not as good at detoxifying. Having been exposed later in life, we're going to see and be concerned about more problems, and in particular problems that we all fear, like dementia.
So I guess the in for a penny, in for a pound kind of thing. I mean, I would imagine that there are centers where exposure was higher, right? Large metropolitan cities, people out in the country, maybe not so much. Is that playing out in your research?
So it's a very good point. We looked at exposures due to leaded gasoline, and we did that because that's the primary source of lead that we distributed in our environment over the last 100 years. For that source of exposure, if you grew up in dense urban areas along busy roadways or just near lead emitting facilities. So for example, if you live near a bus line, let's say you live near a transportation route for mail carriers, all of those would lead you to have higher exposure. And I've actually biked around cities with air pollution chemists with air pollution sensors on our backs to see, well, are there even microenvironment differences? And we found that house to house within a certain block or neighborhood, your exposure is going to go up or down based on characteristics that you can't control. For example, homes at the bottom of a hill are going to have higher exposures because trucks are going to hit the hill, slam on the brakes, and then gun the engine to go up the hill. And that send out a plume of emissions that you're not going to see at the top of the hill. Those are things you're probably not thinking about when you're buying your home. It's hard to, retrospect about your childhood. Where did I live? Was it near a busy road, etc.? We can't really know. Although I'll tell you, we do have tools for looking at your bone and estimating how much lead you've been exposed to over the preceding decades. Yeah.
Wow. That's fascinating. You know, there was a study we talked about on the show probably about 8 or 9 years ago that linked people who live closer to very busy roadways,
Mm-hmm.
highways, and large avenues have a much higher rate of both cardiac ischemic events and stroke. And
Mm-hmm.
the logic behind that was this particulate matter that's being spewed from the car's exhaust, even though lead is not one of them. These particles, we inhale them, and they readily show up in our bloodstream, and
Mm-hmm.
they drive disease states. And you know, this is why if you're buying a house today and you're planning on having children, you have young children, you're better off being off the beaten path, where at least the air is cleaner because you don't have highways and byways just literally atomizing this stuff into the air you breathe.
Yeah, and you mentioned stroke and cardiovascular disease. Your distance to a roadway has now been robustly linked to risk for diseases of the aging brain and diseases of neurodevelopment. So ADHD in kids, but then Alzheimer's, Parkinson's in adults. These particles that are emitted that we breathe in aren't kind of selectively targeting, our heart. They're hitting everything. And every major organ system studied so far has shown to suffer from exposure. Incidentally, for the brain, there is one plausible pathway, which is that your nose has nasal nerves that connect directly to the brain, doesn't pass any intermediate steps, so that you can make decisions really quickly if you smell something like smoke from a fire, right? That seems like it may make us extra susceptible to air pollution because pollution particles have been observed transducing along those nasal nerves directly into the brain. And it's one hypothesis about why folks who live near busy roadways or in air polluted areas are more likely to have psychiatric problems. They're more likely to be admitted to psychiatric inpatient wards during high air pollution events, and they're more likely to have higher rates of Alzheimer's dementia.
So I want to ask this question now before we delve deeper into the research itself, because I want to understand, and the audience wants to understand how you extrapolated the data to be able to give it a gravity and IQ value. But Sean Wasson says he's watching on YouTube. Anything on ethanol and ozone it causes, well, not even ozone, but I find that when BP what was it, BPA became the evil plasticizer, they gave industry enough time to find a solution, and it was a nephew of BPA that does the same thing. It's still a endocrine disruptor. So I find that industry only does what's good for industry, and when we realize that, hey, maybe atomizing lead into entire city airways isn't a good idea. Let's abandon lead, just like they abandoned asbestos, by the way, for car automobile brakes. Is ethanol any safer?
I wish I could contribute to that discussion, but I don't know. It's not something I've studied, and I haven't, frankly, seen a lot that's just come across my transom because I monitor studies in other domains, and I haven't seen much about that. You mentioned BPA. We've taken lead out of gasoline some places, but it's still used regularly, for example, in piston aircraft. So if you live near an airport, particularly a small or mid-sized airport, it's plausible that you are breathing lead emitted in 2021 by a fuel-burning aircraft. So, it's like we take one step forward, one step back, two steps forward. Anytime we can replace something that we know is a carcinogen, endocrine disruptor, toxicant, great. But until we get better at preventive or precautionary approaches to the chemicals we use, as you mentioned, at the beginning of our conversation, we're always going to be paying for it 50 years from now, right?
We're never going to get away from this because it'll always be the toxicant du jour phenomenon. Mm-hmm. But getting back to lead, for people who don't know this, lead is a surfactant. It keeps particles that in the internal combustion engine, you have explosions, controlled explosions, and those explosions quite often can make burned fuels create deposits on the walls of the cylinders, which ultimately will scratch the cylinders and the engine is ruined. And so lead was used as a surfactant to keep those burned particles from sticking to things and allow them to just blow out of the exhaust pipe easily. So have we replaced detergents and surfactants that today with better alternatives than lead? I mean, I know we still have the same problem, and ethanol is not the answer. There has to be other detergents and surfactants in fuel today. Am I right?
Yeah. Again, I wish I had more to tell you. I'm not savvy about the fuel sources we've switched to. I do know the reason we switched away from lead wasn't to protect human health. It was because lead poisoned catalytic converters. And we had a new plan in the 1970s that we wanted new model cars started in 75 to have catalytic converters, primarily to fight acid rain. So we got a ton of co-benefits from that. That's actually something we find again and again, which is when we take one step, when we ask industry to do something a little harder, to take a little less profit, to protect one domain of society, in this case, the environment, it almost always pays off in other domains, in this case, our health and longevity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, so talk about the formulary that you used. How did you arrive at this number? And we're going to say the number in a minute because it's astonishing. But there's a cumulative number of IQ points that we have lost over the period of time that we used leaded gas till when we stopped pretty much most of it, of like 849 million cumulative IQ points we've lost as a society. Is that correct?
That's right. That's our estimate. And the way we arrived at that number is we have known now for many years that there is a dose response relationship between lead exposure for kids and deficits in IQ. So IQ is just a number that describes your brain's cognitive performance ability. And multiple studies in multiple countries have compared kids along different levels of lead exposure, compared them to their peers without lead exposure, and they've developed a pretty robust estimate of how many IQ points you would have developed if you hadn't been exposed to that lead. So we took those estimates and we applied them to our estimates of the number of Americans who were exposed to lead as children. And we can talk about how we figured that out. But the math was actually quite simple. We figured out, right, how many Americans were exposed to high levels of lead as kids. And we were able to pin down the likely numbers of folks exposed to different levels. So not just high or low, but actual blood lead levels, because since the mid-70s, we've been regularly surveilling Americans and American kids in particular for their blood lead levels. So we knew the correspondence between a kid's blood lead levels and the amount of lead that we've been burning in gasoline. And those correspond really highly. We then took that information to look back in time when we didn't used to surveil Americans and ask what was in their blood. But we did know how much lead we were burning in fuel. We put those numbers together to say, right, based on the amount of fuel with lead in it that was being used when you, Carl, were a kid, we can estimate the likelihood that folks in your age bracket had exposures 1, 2, 3, up to 7 times the current value that triggers clinical concern. We then took those numbers and we said, right, for each of those exposure bands, how many IQ points would you likely have lost, given what we know about the dose-response relationship? And that's where we arrived at over 800 million as a society.
Now, what were you able to kind of like a blue zone type of an approach? Were you able to say, and based on the population in those years, the number of cars owned, these metropolitan areas were the highest risk where, were you able to do that?
Is someone able to do that? Probably yes. What we did is collapsed across the country using census data for the whole country. Next steps that we want to look at are things like, are there ethnic and racial differences? The answer is going to be yes, because we know, following surveillance that started in the 70s, that Black Americans have been disproportionately exposed to lead for a variety of reasons we can talk about. In the late 70s, I would say the average blood lead level for an African American child was 5 times the most recent reference value, whereas for the average white child, it was 3 times. Both is way too high. But we're guessing that there's going to be large disparities that we want to learn more about. What we haven't thought about, and what you're raising, which I think is an interesting question, is can we look at community to community differences? Are there cities that were worse? Are there states?
I gotta believe there is. I mean, there has to be locations where the exposure was higher. Like we said before, like upstate New York, homes were acres apart. You'd had no mass transit. You're just not going to have it as you are. Like I grew up in Bed-Stuy, Brooklyn. I'm sure I was exposed to a lot. I lived right off Myrtle Avenue. We had factories on my street, trucks and so on. So, but obviously, lead is impervious to the color of your skin. So what is it about the Black community that put them in a position to be at greater risk? Is it because they dwelled more so in the metropolitan areas where the highest production of burned gas and fuels were?
Yeah. So we don't know fully, right? But the best explanations are the ones that are still true, which is that we've been preferentially citing lead-emitting facilities near communities of color, near low-income communities. When we put lead in gasoline, it preferentially burdened folks in dense urban areas along busy roadways, which if you could afford to live somewhere else, you did, right? And there are now what I call legacy lead problems that are chasing those communities, because it's not just the lead in gas, it's also the lead in the paints, in the pipes.
As you said before, Flint, lead in the water, really.
Absolutely. And what we've learned since Flint is that Flint is not an isolated event.
Right.
There's estimates that up to 3,000 communities in the country have ongoing lead exposure problems that are Flint magnitude that are under the radar. And sometimes it's communities within a wider community. Sometimes it's like Flint, where it's the whole city. And look, we banned the use of lead service lines in 1986. So there's an estimate that 22 million of us live in homes with water run through lead service lines. Now, if the water's treated well, your risk is pretty low. It's not zero, by the way, and there's no safe level of lead. The current, achievement is that we've gotten everyone's lead levels down to just 100 times higher than what we anticipate you would have seen in prehistory. So before we started using lead in all our industrial uses, we've gotten our exposures down to just 100 times, and we're celebrating. And that's great, right? Because it used to be an order of magnitude higher. But it's a huge problem, and I'm biased.
Listen, I'm old enough to remember when a number 2 pencil had a cylinder of lead in it before graphite was introduced.
Oh no!
So when I was in first and second grade, we were still using lead-based pencils.
Wow.
So I would put that pencil in my mouth when I was a kid, and I had friends who got poked with it, and they had a black dot on their skin for the rest of their lives. And so lead has been a mainstay. What I want to do now is I want to take our break, and when we come back, obviously we stopped using it to a great degree, but there has to still be residual oxidized lead on surfaces, inside of walls, inside of homes, where it got in there and it stayed in there, and it comes out when really, when we have these really turbulently windy days and you can actually feel the breeze coming through cracks in your walls. It's like, that's got to be recirculating. I want to talk about residual lead that's still out there when we come back, okay?
Great.
All right, so stay tuned. We'll be right back with more Superhuman Radio. Don't go away. More than 240 million Americans take supplements daily in pill form, but poor nutrient absorption means the promised results are rarely achieved. Healthy Cell uses a clinically proven patent-pending gel delivery system that increases absorption by 165% over pill form. Go to shrnetwork.biz/healthycell. That's HEALTHYCELL today and use the code SHR to save 20% off your purchase of Healthy Cell supplements.
New Mass Pro Synthogen X2 just upped its own legendary game. To distance itself even further from the rest of the pack, Synthogen X2 now has double the key active ingredients. If you've ever wondered what steroid-like recovery feels like, Synthogen X2 delivers. See why others compare it favorably to powerful bodybuilding drugs at synthogen.com. Mass Pro Synthogen. When you train with it, you'll gain with it.
Dogs should be powered by fat and protein, not carbs. That's why Visionary Pet makes low-carb, ketogenic dog food for dogs of all breeds and life stages. From kibble to freeze-dried and even low-carb treats, all Visionary Pet recipes are very low-carb, ketogenic, and made with 100% real meat protein. Shop now and use code SHR for 20% off your first order today. Your dog deserves the lifelong benefits of optimal nutrition. Make the switch to Visionary and see why smart dogs eat low carb.
Over 30 million men experience a form of erectile dysfunction. Meet Eddie, a device designed to help men strengthen and maintain their erections. Based on 2021 clinical trials, over 95% of men experience positive results wearing Eddie instead of relying on costly pills and experiencing side effects. I checked out Eddie by Giddy at shrnetwork.biz/Eddie. Eddie offers free resizes and the product works. Sign up for a subscription and save $20 off your first device with promo code SUPER20. That's SUPER20. A 60-day guarantee can't be beat. Treat ED with Eddie. Eddie by Giddy at shrnetwork.biz/Eddie. C60, also known as Buckminster fullerene, is the most powerful, most versatile antioxidant in the world. It's been shown in studies to double the lifespan of rodents. We all know the importance of taking antioxidants to slow aging, reduce inflammation, and improve mitochondrial function and energy production. But there are literally hundreds of antioxidants that would cost you thousands of dollars to take every day. I take one. I take C60 from C360 Health. Revive and Rejuvenate are two blends that harness the power of C60. Don't waste another minute. Go to shrnetwork.biz/revive and use the code SHR for 15% off and free shipping inside the United States today. Are you 35 or older? Every year after puberty, your growth hormone decreases sometimes by 50% by the age of 35, and it only keeps going down from there. This affects everything from making it harder to recover from workouts, sleep, and a general loss of a sense of well-being. It also affects your ability to get and stay lean. BioPro Plus is the first of its kind, 100% non-synthetic alternative to prescription synthetic growth hormone treatments. All the benefits without any of the needles or side effects and 100% safe. Previously only available through doctors, you can go to shrnetwork.biz/biopro, that's BIOPRO, and use code SHR30 for $30 off today.
This is the Superhuman Channel, where brawn and brains finally meet.
Welcome back. We're talking with Aaron Reuben. We're talking about those of us who are old enough to remember being exposed to leaded gas, swallowing some of it once in a while siphoning it, lead pencils, lead paint in homes. I remember the apartment I grew up in Brooklyn had leaded paint. And I remember it specifically because you could take a chip of that paint, take a piece of paper, and you could write on it, and it looked like a pencil you were writing with. It had that same leaded look. So, okay, we've done away with leaded gas since 86, you said, right? Is that right?
We started in 75. We took it out fully in 96.
Okay, so there still has to be residual powdered lead that was a particulate in the roadway, and then it settles in places where no one's cleaning. Isn't there still residual lead out there in our environment?
Carl, it's everywhere. It's in the soil near roadways. It's in our homes from exfoliating paint. We already talked about how it's in our water. There's a trend seen nationwide every year where children's blood lead levels go up in the summer and then back down in the winter. And the reason is so much lead is in the soils outside and around and in our homes that in the summer, when dust kicks up, it's drier, it's hotter, they're just breathing more. and their blood lead levels go up. It says that the environmental remnants of our uses are so present that we have seasonal variations. It's like, pollen season.
Fascinating.
There's a lead season.
That's fascinating. Now, before automotive, the inception of automobiles and the need for leaded gas, do we have records before that of what lead exposure was like? Were we able to check blood levels of people for lead?
Yeah, so the best estimates I've seen have looked at atmospheric and environmental levels. So they've looked at sediment layers and lake beds.
Right.
They've looked in glaciers, and they've been able to tell us what the sort of background general levels of lead have been. And we can see massive spikes during the Industrial Revolution as we started to burn fuel and use lead in different settings. So we've been using lead pipes for over 100 years. And in fact, in the turn of the century, the highest lead exposures in most countries were through lead service lines. And in that setting, if you had well water and you lived outside the cities, you were actually doing a whole lot better off because you weren't getting such a high lead dose. We've used it in different settings at different times. Right now, it's a big component of car batteries. And in developing countries, there's a huge effort to kind of ad hoc recycle these and get the special elements back, the minerals, the metals. And that's done kind of in these open pits. And we're starting to see kids in developing countries with lead exposures just as high as we saw here when we burned lead in our tailpipes. So it's everywhere. It's hard to know at any one time where it's coming from. We used to put it in solder for cans, so you would get it in your food. But we do know that atmospheric levels, the levels that humans before Industrial Revolution were exposed to, were an order of magnitude smaller than you or I right now with no discernible lead hazard, right? I'm not drinking any water right now. I'm not breathing any lead dust. But you and I, our blood lead levels are still going to be 100 times what our ancestors had.
The home that I grew up in Richmond Hill or South Ozone Park, Queens. After we moved out of Brooklyn, I was like 13 years old. We moved to Queens. That home had a lead water main. It came through the wall, out from outside. It was this big, massive patina grade pipe, and it had this big, almost bubble-shaped end on it because when they installed them, they sweat fitted it, and the lead melted a little bit, and it bubbled up. And then we had copper pipes that my father had put in because most of the plumbing was lead back then. Mm-hmm. But when they sweat fit a copper pipe, they're using lead-based solder, lead, antimony, and a couple other things. And depending how skilled the plumber was, there would be little to no lead exposure in the pipe where the water was traveling. But if your plumber was a hack, there could be gobs of lead in the pipe, and your water is passing over it every day and picking up millimicrons of it, and you're just drinking it, showering in it, brushing your teeth. So it's really amazing to me that we're not all stupider because of all the lead exposure that we've had as young people.
I mean, we are, like, not to be too tongue-in-cheek, but we are all stupider. Like, there's a one-to-one correspondence between your exposure and the health of your brain. For most of us, we're okay, right? We're knocked down a bit from where we would have been, our potential. But our potential was high enough that we still get through school. We make good relationships. We get good jobs. We can function.
But let's do something real quick. So, to kind of set the table for IQ. IQ is not your ability to learn your 12 times tables, and it's not your ability to learn English and math. IQ is what some people would call critical thinking, the ability to see sequences, for instance, like and go, oh, I see what they're doing. Every third number starts with a 6. Like those things are those things are skill sets that allow you to be a critical thinker, to be able to look at something that's not in your purview and rationally figure things out because you can connect dots. So when we talk about IQ, you may have people that are successful stockbrokers, but when they look at something and that should be obvious to them, it's not. It eludes them. It's like, well, I just can't connect those dots. I don't understand the relationship. And I am going to be crude and say there's a lot of people in our population that fit that description.
Yeah, I'm laughing because obviously I don't disagree. And I would just add a little nuance there, which is IQ is kind of a catch-all. It's an umbrella that we fit lots of different abilities under. And two people can have the same IQ, you know, I'm putting air quotes because IQ it's kind of just a construct that we like to be able to measure it, but it's really not necessarily a standalone thing. Two people could have the same IQ, but have a really different profile of strengths and weaknesses.
Right.
So I am not a spatial genius. You know, we've talked a lot about pipe fittings and car design. If you were to ask me to fix something, I would really struggle. But if you give me something that falls more into a verbal linguistic challenge, I'm going to do great. And all your listeners can think of themselves and say, hey, I'm good at this and bad at this. Two people can have the same IQ and fit different profiles.
Right.
The thing about lead exposure, just to bring it back to that, is it doesn't really seem to target one strength or one weakness. It's kind of a global event that lowers your capacity kind of across the board. Obviously, you're still going to have your own independent strengths and weaknesses. But as we look at a society, what we've done is shifted the bell curve. You know, this bell curve says most people are going to have an IQ of 100, some are going to have an IQ of 140, and some are going to fall into the domain that we call a diagnosable impairment, meaning their cognitive ability is low enough that it's going to be hard for them to function independently. We've shifted the bell curve so that there are fewer geniuses and there's more people on that impaired zone. For people in that impaired zone, there's huge consequences for your life. It's really hard to finish schooling. It's hard to get good quality jobs. It's hard to make and maintain relationships. You know, it takes a lot of thinking power to navigate the world with humans. That's kind of consequences to the human level. And then at society, obviously, people have put dollar estimates, you know, lifetime earning potential per IQ point. And they pegged it around 10 grand. So if you apply that 10 grand per IQ point of lifetime earning potential per person to our IQ estimates, it says we've cost the US GDP trillions of dollars in lost potential.
Right. Yeah, it's really, again, we can look back at everything from treating syphilis with mercury to lead. You know, I mean, we really, we really are so pompous and we think we know everything. And this is where we get into trouble. And we're seeing it day in and day out anyway. We've talked about epigenetics on this show for a very, very long time. One of the most fascinating things that I learned in the past 2 years about epigenetics is that innate intelligence is passed along epigenetically. It's not just your genetic expression to disease states. The reason a baby deer knows to fear an adult human is because epigenetically it's been inscribed into them. And this was proven with a study that they did with rodents, where they took male rodents. It was a Pavlovian approach. They let them smell cherry and they shocked them. And they did this for some length of time. And then they put them back into the general population and had them mate. And all of their offspring, regardless of whether they're male or female rodents, when they smelled cherry, they became agitated and nervous, and they started to display anxiety, which means that the experience of the father was passed along epigenetically in his germline, in his sperm, to the offspring. So, you know, a lot of people like to talk about epigenetics and disease states, and that's good. But one of the things that people are missing is transgenerational epigenetics also conveys species-specific intelligence to the offspring. So they don't have to learn the hard way, you know, don't walk up to a human, he's going to kill you, right? They know that, like they're born, they know it. Is there any linkage between transgenerational epigenetics changes in 4, 5, 6 generations up from people and or rodents that are exposed to lead?
It's a fascinating question. What I do know is that there are epigenetic signatures of lead exposure. And in fact, we're trying to start using these in a research context where we can't go back in time and figure out what your lead exposure was as a kid, but we can look at your epigenetic signature right now to figure out what likely happened. What I haven't seen is that next question: do those epigenetic signatures pass down to the next generation? And that's a great question, and I think we should evaluate it. It's the kind of thing we can look at. Obviously, animal models like the rats you're mentioning are a great place to do that first. And there might be studies on that. You know, I'm kind of a human person. I mostly follow and work with human studies. I only look into the animal studies when I have specific questions. And now, thanks to our conversation, I have a specific question. I'm going to look for that. My guess is that we are starting to evaluate that, but I'm not aware of the studies. It would be very interesting. You know, unlike the cherry fear conditioning example you gave, where there's kind of a clear lesson learned, like cherries are bad, it's not clear what, you know, there wouldn't be an advantage to having an epigenetic signature of lead. Right now, we believe
No, absolutely. In fact, we did a show maybe 6 or 7 years ago where a group of survivors from fathers who were deployed in Vietnam and exposed to Agent Orange, and they showed that there were transgenerational epigenetic effects from their father being exposed to the great-grandchildren have some of those same predispositions, genetic predispositions to certain diseases, like they had been exposed. So the bad news about epigenetics is the bad stuff gets passed along too. Like in other words, if the lead knocks out a couple IQ points, then just because your great-great-grandfather was exposed to it, you may have just had a couple IQ points, sacrificed because of his exposure,
Yeah, and there, one thing that it makes it really hard to know is how many of the problems that we're experiencing now, for example, with increasing rates of ADHD, increasing rates of autism, how many of those are due to events that kids experience now versus their grandparents? I've seen some interesting studies that tie rates of autism in different communities to events 2 generations before. And we don't know what those are. It's just we've been able to tie it to those because we've been linking genetic markers across time. Now we're asking ourselves, oh gosh, is there some element in the environment that if I'm exposed to today, my grandkids will have greater risk for autism? The answer is yes, but we don't know what it is.
Absolutely. So here's a real an observation I've leaned on in the past. Then we're going to take a break and come back and wrap this up. You look at any country that experienced real famine, like the Russians, the Irish, where they literally, people were dying in the street, people were dragging frozen bodies in and cooking them because that's all they had to eat. And you see a very high rate of alcoholism and depression generations later. The Irish suffer from it. The Russians suffer from it. Anytime you see a population that truly experienced famine, like real famine, not like, oh, it's pandemic and I can't get my favorite hamburger, where people are like dying on the street from starvation, the imprint of depression and alcoholism is guaranteed to be there for generations thereafter. And I was always fascinated by that.
It's fascinating.
Yeah. I'll give you a chance to opine on that on the other side. Sit tight. We'll be right back. And then when we come to the top of the hour, we're going to be joined by Logan Christopher, and we're going to talk about pine pollen, things that you're really going to want to know about. So stay tuned. If you'd like a shortcut to better sleep, more energy, and calmer, more stable moods, then you should make sure you're supplementing with magnesium daily. Let me tell you why. About 75% of people are magnesium deficient. This deficiency can lead to higher levels of anxiety, irritability, trouble sleeping, and low energy. It can even contribute to foot and leg cramps while you sleep. Magnesium Breakthrough by Bioptimizers is the single best magnesium supplement in the world. Simply take 2 capsules before you go to bed, and you'll be amazed by the improvements in your mood and energy levels and how much more rested you feel when you wake up. I take Magnesium Breakthrough every night, and I sleep better because I use it. Go to magbreakthrough.com/SHR and use the code SHR10 during checkout to save 10% off and get free shipping. Check it out. Plant medicine has become all the rage for mental optimization. Now there's an ancient plant medicine rapidly growing in popularity that experts believe might just be the alcohol of the future. It's called True Kava. Kava is a natural food-grade elixir that has been used for over 3,000 years by South Pacific Islanders as safe, non-addictive alternative to drugs and alcohol. By naturally boosting the brain's main feel-good chemicals, dopamine, serotonin, and GABA, Kava provides you with both increased relaxation and mental clarity at the same time. True Kava is a new form of stabilized full-spectrum traditional kava that is third-party lab tested for quality and safety. Go to shrnetwork.biz/true kava, and that's TRUKAVA, all one word, and use code SHR for 25% off today. Most people have heard of phytoestrogens, but did you know there are beneficial phytoandrogens? The top source of these is pine pollen. It even contains trace amounts of testosterone and DHEA. If you're looking for a 100% natural testosterone booster, this is worth trying. Lots of men love it, and it even works for women. Lost Empire Herbs offers the highest quality wild harvested, non-irradiated pine pollen backed by a 365-day money-back guarantee. It works for you, or you don't have to pay for it with nothing to send back. Go to shrnetwork.biz/lost empire. Use code SHR. Get 15% off your order today. If you've listened to this show for any length of time, you know that I have struggled to give up coffee for years. Coffee has destroyed my gut and it's impaired my health. Well, I haven't had coffee in months thanks to a product called Magic Mind. Magic Mind is the first nootropic blend I actually feel working. One shot and I'm good all day long. My memory is crystal clear and I'm able to function and have great focus without coffee or caffeine for that matter. If you want to try a product that really works, if you're like me and you want to give up coffee forever, or you just need something occasionally that will help you lift the brain fog, Magic Mind is your product. I promise you that this product you will feel when you use it. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Magic Mind, all one word, and use the code SHR for a whopping 20% off your first order. Being superhuman means being conscientious about the choices we make. White Oak Pastures is superhuman when it comes to raising livestock. They're committed to animal welfare, land regeneration, and rural revival. They responsibly manage the entire process from the pasture to your doorstep. High-quality, pasture-raised, great-tasting meat from a farm you can trust. Full nose-to-tail selections. They even have options for your pet. Go to shrnetwork.biz/white oak and use the code SUPERHUMAN to save 10% off your entire first order. Have you been struggling to achieve results in the gym? Trouble sleeping through the night? Overwhelmed with stress or anxiety? Look no further than Infiniwell supplements. They have designed products to address specific needs like muscle growth, hormone balance, sleep, and anxiety from the first use. Infiniwell helps you live well. Go to shrnetwork.biz/bewell. That's BEWELL and use code SHR20 and start living well today.
Move over, superheroes. This is the Superhuman Channel.
Welcome back. We're talking with Aaron Reuben about this fascinating study that looks at lead exposure, mostly from leaded gas, which many of us and baby boomers were exposed to in great amounts, and how it affects IQ. So, displacement of lead. There's lots of minerals and things that displace other minerals. Is there anything we could be doing? I understand other short of real chelation therapy, which takes intravenous chelation and then blood donation, by the way. Okay, so to do chelation therapy properly, it's not just enough to take DMSA and pee. You have to take the DMSA and then you have to donate your blood. And I feel bad if somebody gets that because it's not good blood. And you may have to do this twice every 2 months for a year and a half to truly have an impact on the any type of heavy metal that's trapped in your body. But are there other things that we can do short of that that will help displace lead's uptake and or protect us from whatever lead is actually in our body, short of not breaking a bone, obviously? I don't know.
Yeah. Obviously, it's a great next question. In terms of existing lead hazards, obviously you want to reduce your exposure. So if you live in a home built before 1986, go ahead and get the water tested for lead. And then you get to decide, are the levels low enough for me? In my own home, our test came back, quote unquote, below, trace, I think was the word they used, which means it's below an action limit. But it wasn't enough for me to serve to my 2-year-old. So I bought an over-the-counter water filter that has charcoal in it and that at least claims to remove lead. And so that's peace of mind. But if you believe you're being exposed, and we all likely are in different ways that are hard to anticipate, nutrition in general does seem to play a role, at least in communities that have been looked at, like kids, so that kids with better nutrition, and it's hard to know what that is comprised of in this sense. If we're looking at lead uptake into bone, it seems that a more calcium-rich diet helps keep the lead out of your bones. And again, when we think about lead being remobilized, there's some evidence that in older folks on calcium supplementation, you see less lead remobilization. But more specifically, exact things you can take or do, I'm not aware of. Now, there might be evidence out there, but if it is, it's pretty niche, shall we say. So the main thing is
any evidence that lead is photoactive, that the exposure to sun when someone has lead in them does anything at all, makes it worse, makes it better, anything like that?
I've never come across prescriptions like that. And I can't off the top of my head think about plausible ways that would be the case. Mm-hmm. I think it's more about preventing your exposure by taking a look at where you are. So right now, your exposure to exfoliating paint dust and lead service lines is probably the first guess. And then based on where you live, lead and soil, there's also, it's in some cosmetics, it's in some kids products, not supposed to be, it's in spices.
They found and women who buy red lipstick, if you're not buying it from a reputable brand, you're buying it off the street, a lot of red lipstick has lead in it. That's how they create the red color in it.
Yeah, and depending on where you live and the flow of goods, some of these problems are a lot bigger. In South Asia, it's a particularly big problem. So I would say, like, main take-home story, try to reduce your exposure. If you have been exposed, two things. One, we know that eating well, a whole food balanced diet, things like that, might be helpful. I say might because it's just not something that I've seen a ton of evidence about either way. But then there's other, I think about your brain. And to me, that's the scariest set of harmful outcomes. We already talked about how we've knocked a few IQ points off of everyone. But I worry about the long-term consequences later in life as we start to age. We all experience brain aging, lowered cognitive capacity. What we want to do is maintain our ability to stay above an impaired state as long as possible. And there are lifestyle choices you can make that you talk about a lot on your show that even if you've been exposed to lead are going to help keep you healthy longer. Being active, eating well, staying social. All of these things have been implicated in lower risk for diseases of the aging brain.
Yeah. Listen, I want to thank you so much for being here today, Aaron. This is fascinating stuff. And I think it's important stuff, too, for people to understand. There's a lot of hidden things in our environment we just don't think about because we're so busy, all of our mission critical things that we have to do every day that we're not thinking about. But this is one that you have to pay attention to, especially if you have young children in the house. Are they being exposed to lead? Do you live in an old home? Have your water tested? Is there a room in the house that has old paint on it?
And ask for, if you take your kid in for a routine well visit at age 1, 2, 3, go ahead and ask for a lead test. They're not that expensive. And if it comes back low, great, no problem. If it comes back high, you'd rather know than not.
Yeah. Thanks for being here, Aaron.
Pleasure, real pleasure. Hope to see you again soon.
Take care. I got a cough. We're going to take a break. We'll be right back. I don't have myself. I didn't have myself in the stream. I backed myself up by accident. Welcome to the show, Logan Christopher. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Kyle. Looking forward to today.
I'm really looking forward to this discussion. In fact, I already got 3 text messages this morning. One of them from my friend Jeff. I'm going to ask you about the tincture versus the other product. When was pine pollen discovered?
I mean, it really depends on how you define the word discovered. It is not well known. Like, most people are familiar with pine pollen as that yellow coating that dusts their vehicles, right?
Right.
But as far as a food supplement, it has been used in China for thousands of years. So they've had it historically in there. As far as in the USA and like Western mind looking at it, it's really only been used for, I'd say, a couple of decades at most. I don't have a specific date to give you, but it's certainly something that is becoming more popular. Still, most people haven't heard of it.
So why do people take pine pollen? I mean, I know it's a phytoandrogen, but talk about it. Does it actually have molecular testosterone, molecular DHEA in it? Like under the microscope, it looks exactly like the same molecule we have in our body?
Yes, according to the research that looked at it, it has those specific molecules. Now, it's very trace amounts, so this isn't like taking steroids or anything like that. It's very small. What is likely having more action, and they've looked at several different species of pine pollen to find this is in there. It can be hard because different tests may find it or may not. But in addition to these quote-unquote human hormones, which we find in the plant world, there's also specific plant androgens, phytoandrogens, such as the gibberellins and brasinosteroids. And although the testosterone is there, I really think there's having much more of the action is coming from the plant molecules, which are available in larger amounts.
So I take testosterone. Would I feel a benefit from using pine pollen?
Yeah, we have heard from some customers that they take testosterone and also take the pine pollen. When you're taking something like pine pollen, it has these hormones in there, and that's going to be the main benefit, but you're also getting all kinds of other nutrition along with it. So there's vitamins, there's minerals, there's a ton of different compounds, flavonoids and whatnot involved in there. So there's maybe some other benefits as well. We have heard some customers say that take this and that on top of it, and they get even more bang for their buck, so to speak.
So, and here's why I ask you that, because there's a phenomenon when a man goes on testosterone therapy, he usually feels amazing for about the first 8 months to a year, but then it just doesn't feel that good anymore. And I know why this is. I've done a lot of research into it. So the negative feedback loop that tells your testicles to stop making testosterone also tells your testicles to make stop making a lot of other hormones that your testicles make, like progesterone and pregnenolone and stuff like that. And so when progesterone levels drop, DHT goes up, because progesterone is a natural 5-alpha reducer inhibitor. So DHT goes up, men start to lose their hair, they start getting acne, they feel a little crabby and crotchety, blood sugar management becomes an issue. So a lot of guys will go back and start taking HCG, because one of the things that HCG does is it makes your body make progesterone again. I'm wondering if taking pine pollen with testosterone would actually backload and fill in some of those hormones that the body stops making because you're taking testosterone. That's why I asked that question.
Yeah, it's an interesting question. And I like to think of the hormones as a symphony, right? Like, everyone tends to, all men tend to focus in on testosterone, but yeah, you're missing the forest for the trees, all these other things. So when you're coming in with something like bioidentical testosterone, you're giving this one signal to the body, and that works great, as you said, for some time, but then the body is going to move around that essentially. So when possible, there's a time and a place for testosterone replacement, absolutely. But I tend towards more natural things, because the body is going to work more in alignment with that and be able to fill out. So yeah, there's a tiny amount of testosterone in here. And then we have the phytoandrogens that bind to the receptors. And honestly, we don't scientifically know what exact specific ways that they all work. But the body's going to make use of what it can and kind of not do stuff with what it can't, essentially. So it's going to be more modulating to the hormone system than something direct and reductive, like just taking directly testosterone.
So talk about the preparation, right? Or not all pine pollen products are made the same. Talk about irradiation and stuff like that.
Yeah. Let me mention one other thing on there. We have had customers too that were taking testosterone replacement and have come off of that using something like pine pollen, as well as some of our other supplements as well.
Wow.
So that is a possibility. Yeah.
Okay.
So as far as preparation, so pine pollen is literally the pollen from pine trees. If you have pine trees in your areas, you can go out in the springtime, you shake the tree and you'll see the yellow dust just come out. So that gets collected. It can be a pain to collect it, but that is collected. Then honestly, you can just consume that straight right there. For our product, it is then steam sterilized because it being a natural substance, mold can grow on it. So typically it's irradiated. Most of the pine pollens out there will be irradiated for this to happen, which will kill it off. But, you know, radiation does things to DNA and whatnot that we don't necessarily want. So ours is steam sterilized and dried out, and then you can consume it just straight like that. That's the pine pollen powder. We also put it in capsules because, you know, people like to take capsules, and pine pollen has a slightly bitter taste. Most people come to enjoy it. It's not horrible compared to some other herbs, but some people do not like it, especially since most people have relegated the bitter taste out of their diet to their detriment. Then we also have the pine pollen tincture, which you were asking about. So this is an alcoholic extract.
My friend Jeff said, I was looking at the pine pollen product. Do you recommend the tincture over the powder? Why would someone want the tincture versus just the encapsulated powder?
Yeah, so they're a little bit different with these ones, especially. It's a bit more than some other herbs. So I see the pine pollen powder more as a superfood, right? You can consume large amounts of this. And in fact, we even recommend up to 3 tablespoons a day, which is a large amount that can have some great effects in the body. And with this, we see it as more hormone modulating, right? So it's going to go kind of work with the body. The pine pollen tincture, for whatever reason, the alcohol draws out these phytoandrogens and makes them directly available into your bloodstream. There's some evidence that the phytoandrogens don't survive the digestive tract. I think that may be true to a degree, but based on results people get with just using the powder, it's working to some degree. So it's not 100%. But with the tincture, you have this alcohol extract, so it draws out the hormonal component. Then you place that under your tongue, and it absorbs directly into the bloodstream, so it can have a kind of a faster acting and stronger effect. So I see this more directly as testosterone boosting. So some people will find better benefits with the powder. Some people will find better benefits with the tincture. Many of our customers take both of them as well.
If you're taking the powder, it's in capsules. How many capsules is a serving, and how many servings should someone take a day?
With pine pollen and a lot of herbs, the dosage really is flexible. So some people will get by with just, say, 2 or 3 capsules a day. We have it in the capsules. We also have it in the powdered form. So especially if you're going for that bigger dose, which I think 3 tablespoons would be equivalent to 18 capsules, it's much easier to take it in the powdered form. You just mix it in water and then down it. Easy to go. Similar sort of thing with the tincture. Some people will take half a dropper per day. Actually, women, sometimes they'll take it because a lot of women are deficient in testosterone as well. Oftentimes, just like a drop or 2 can be a good dose for women. But I've known guys that also take 6-8 droppers full per day. That's a pretty heavy dose of it. For myself, when I take it, it's not something I take a lot. I feel like my testosterone's pretty good, and I work with less directly boosting herbs. But when I take a pine pollen tincture, I definitely notice an increase in libido that sometimes gets to the point of being distracting. So I don't always want to be taking that.
Right. Yeah, no, and that's so obviously, do a lot of people, men and women, claim that their libido goes up when they start using it?
Yeah, that's one of the big benefits from the pine pollen. An effect that we notice, especially with the pine pollen powder, and again, don't know all the mechanisms for why this works, is that it seems to help men with morning wood. So you take a big dose before you go to bed, and things will be harder, stay longer. And if it's working then, that's kind of the canary in the coal mine. Then other times you'll often find things are working better as well.
Wow, that's pretty cool. And I mean, who doesn't want more sex, men and women? No, really. It's the driving factor of our species. Let me put this up real quick. Just hold on a second. So if people are interested in giving this a try, and there's a lot of other good stuff here, just for the record. If you go to shrnetwork.biz/lost empire, you can save 15% off of your pine pollen product by using the code SHR. But there's a lot of other stuff that you guys have a lot of different well-known effective herbs there, right?
Yeah, we have probably 50 different SKUs, something like that right now. A lot of single herbs, so more popular ones such as ashwagandha or reishi mushroom, but also some lesser well-known ones. For instance, our ant extract. And the previous interview, you were talking about lead in the bones from the gasoline and all the other places. So Shilajit comes to mind with that. That is a great one. It's known as the destroyer of weakness and the conqueror of mountains. I was sold when I heard those names in the first place. I was like, let me try that stuff. Great for energy and ATP function in the cells. It can help to deliver material into your cells better, but also has some heavy metal detoxing benefits to it as well. So there's a wide range of different stuff there, and we have lots of information over at the website.
Is your ashwagandha organic by any chance?
It is not certified organic, but it is grown biodynamically and organic. Our ashwagandha actually comes from the United States. It's grown on a farm outside of Portland, Oregon. A lot of cool things that go into that product. So yeah, it stands out from many of the other ashwagandhas out there.
Tell me some of the cool things that go into that product. Talk about it.
Yes, so many of our tinctures, not the pine pollen currently, but it is what is called a spagyric tincture. Spagyric is a word that refers to alchemy, the actual lab practice of alchemy. Now, when I say alchemy, most people think of turning lead into gold, right? There was a whole practice of actually making medicines, that kind of got blown out of proportion and whatnot, but making medicines using plant materials, animal materials, different stuff like that. So there's a specific process of adding what are known as the salts in of the plant matter back into the tincture. It takes a couple extra processes, but it makes a stronger tincture essentially that works better in the body. So that's a really cool process that the ashwagandha as well as some of our other tinctures go through.
Ashwagandha is like magic. I know people who take it and they say like they've never felt this good in their lives. And when they stop taking it, they don't feel good. Would you agree that ashwagandha is really a powerful herb?
Yeah, ashwagandha seems to work well for the majority of people out there. Like I very rarely have even heard people say like that one didn't work for me. And we live in a chronically stressed society because of everything going on, and ashwagandha is really good at helping to lower that. It helps support sleep. It's going to help normalize many of the hormones, including testosterone specifically, by bringing down the cortisol, which seems to work in an inverse ratio to that. So ashwagandha is definitely one of my favorite plants.
Is ashwagandha
one I work with a lot.
Is it wise to take ashwagandha with pine pollen?
Yeah, generally with our herbs, there's no problems mixing and matching. So we have customers that take 20 different herbs every single day. Then for me personally, I have like a few I take as a foundation that I work with regularly. Then, just sitting at my desk, I have piles and piles of these tinctures and I take them more intuitively as needed.
So what are the few that you seem to gravitate to all the time that you use consistently?
My basic ones, I drink coffee in the morning and I do a bulletproof style and I add some herbs in that. Chaga mushroom, hoshu wu, maca, and sustanch.
Interesting.
Which would take me a lot of time to go into the details of all those.
What they each do. But you only take pine pollen irregularly because it drives your libido too much and you become distracted.
The pine pollen tincture. So unless, I'm having a fun weekend with the wife when I'm specifically going for that, then I'm not taking that. I do take pine pollen regularly as part of our Phoenix formula, which is pine pollen, the hoshu wu I just mentioned, the shilajit I mentioned previously, and the ant extract as well. That's a good foundational formula that is good for energy and kind of all around hits on a lot of different factors.
So are you saying ant as in the little bug ant extract? Tell me about that.
I am. So again, going way back to Chinese medicine, this has been used for a long, long time. It's a specific species of ant known as the Polyrhicus vicina roger ant. Ant is, you look at nature and a lot of herbal systems, right? Before we had reductionist science, it was like, look at nature, what are the signs and what can do. So the ant, has a super strength. So taking ant, hopefully we can get some of that. So for whatever reason, ant seems really good. Like most people can feel energy from that right away. Like it gives a feelable effect of more energy. And this is great as like a pre-workout. So we include it in our Hercules pre-workout formulas as well as a few other things. So you don't need to worry. There's no like antennas or whatnot. It's a fine powder and have it available in capsule forms in the Phoenix formula at least.
So it's really was it ground up ant? Is that what it is? I mean, how do you make an ant extract? I guess you put it in alcohol, right? After you you powderize?
So the one we sell currently, it's basically a decoction, which is a tea, and they use a large amount of the ant material. Then they distill down or concentrate down the liquid, and then they'll spray dry this till it becomes a powder that you can consume.
On a media, yeah, they put it on fiber or something like that. Yeah, that's how they make ginger extract too. This is fascinating stuff. How long have you been doing this? How long have you been fascinated by herbs?
I've been using herbs. So I got into strength training, and I do some unusual things like juggle kettlebells, bend horseshoes. Recently, I've been working on hanging myself by a rope. So some interesting stuff there. And I'm not naturally strong or athletic. So I was always on the lookout, like, where can I get an edge? And as I dove into health and nutrition, that kind of led me to seeing herbalism. And I took cordyceps mushroom in the first place, and I noticed I had more energy in my workouts. I was hooked from the beginning. So I've been doing this for over a decade now. The company's been around since 2014 was when we got serious about it.
So, I think it's funny that people poo-poo herbs, right? But just about every single pharmaceutical drug in the world was discovered in some natural form, a lot of times in a plant.
Yep.
And, it's like, so the pharmaceutical industry wants us to, like Oz, don't pay attention to those guys over there selling herbs. Pay attention to us, because we're taking those herbs and extracting the compounds in them and putting it in a capsule and selling it to you. But it's like, herbs work because the drugs that they extract from them work. The herbs work. They really do.
Yeah, somehow humanity survived without pharmaceutical medicine for many, many thousands of years.
Yeah.
And what did they use? They used herbal medicines.
I always tell this story when we talk about this, but the Native Americans had cancer, but they used the May apple. I don't even know if it's really an apple. I just know that it's called the May apple. And they used to, when someone had cancer, tumors, they would feed them the May apple. It would make them so sick. They'd vomit and they'd be horrible. But then after the treatment, the tumors would be gone. And so guess what they discovered is in the May apple? The chemo drug called cisplantin. So they extracted cisplantin molecules. They didn't call it then. They named it cisplantin from the May apple, and they discovered this is what's killing the cancer. And now they charge you $16,000 a treatment.
Right? That's our medical model for you right there.
In an altruistic world, they would have given it to people for free. Oh, we discovered it in an apple. We're just going to give it to everybody. Why not everybody do well? But that's not the model that we live by today. So
no, it certainly is not. So yeah, I just live by, with everything going on, just in general, as like a heuristic, a rule of thumb. More natural is better. This doesn't mean you should eat poisonous plants or whatnot, but how can we support our health and our performance in these natural ways? And then avoiding the things like the leaded gasoline that was talked about there. You got to cut down, especially on the estrogenic chemicals, the various endocrine disruptors out there. I mean, that's huge for hormone health, which is why we see the testosterone level decline. Yeah,
plummeting testosterone levels from an epidemiological standpoint. They're going down. When I first started doing this show 16 years ago, the low end of a man's testosterone levels were 420. Today, I think they're 320. Yeah. They just keep shifting the bell curve because the population is getting sicker, and they're going, oh no, the normal is down here now. No, that's sick. When you can't normalize sickness, but that's what they're doing.
Yeah, average is not very good these days, so I want to be anything but average.
That's true. All right, let me plug this one more time. Now, remember, the sponsors make this show possible. We try to put out as much good content that helps people. I get emails from people all the time saying that this show saved their life, that show saved a relative's life. The way you repay me for doing this show is patronize the sponsors. So give Lost Empire Herbs a try. Go to shrnetwork.biz/Lost Empire, all one word. Use the code SHR. You'll save 15% not only off your pine pollen, but that 15% discount is site-wide, right, Logan?
That is correct. And I do want to mention the 365-day money-back guarantee. So we really live by the model of try it, see if it works for you. If it doesn't, then you don't have to pay for it. Just contact us and we'll issue you a refund or exchange. We have different options available. And you have up to a year to do that. So, we stand by our stuff.
And when companies do that, it's because they want you to try it to see if it works for you, because if it works for you, you'll buy it. And they don't want to sell a bottle to somebody that's not going to get anything out of it. That's very, that's very, very admirable. It really does put the put your flesh in the game. The customer not satisfied, they didn't lose any money. So that's very noble, very, very noble. Check him out. Logan, thanks for being here today, brother.
Thanks so much, Carl. It was a blast.
And we will see everybody tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio. Tune in. Don't forget, share the show. You never know whose life you're going to change. They hear one thing in a show, they take action, and all of a sudden they have a better life. So share the show, and we'll see you tomorrow with more Superhuman Radio.